Once upon a time, in a quaint little village nestled between rolling hills, there lived an old woman named Mrs. Jenkins. She was known throughout the village for her kind heart and gentle nature. Despite living alone in a small cottage, Mrs. Jenkins always had a warm smile and a welcoming demeanor. One cold winter's day, as Mrs. Jenkins was returning from the market, she heard a faint meowing coming from behind a pile of snow-covered crates. Curious, she approached and discovered a small, shivering kitten huddled against the cold. Without hesitation, Mrs. Jenkins scooped up the tiny creature and cradled it in her arms. From that day on, the kitten, whom Mrs. Jenkins named Whiskers, became her faithful companion. They would spend their days together, Mrs. Jenkins knitting by the fire while Whiskers curled up at her feet, purring contentedly. As the years passed, Mrs. Jenkins and Whiskers formed an unbreakable bond. Whiskers grew into a handsome cat, but his love and devotion to Mrs. Jenkins never wavered. He would follow her wherever she went, his bright green eyes always watching over her with unwavering loyalty. One day, Mrs. Jenkins fell ill and was confined to her bed. Despite her frailty, Whiskers never left her side, keeping her company with his comforting presence. He would nuzzle her cheek and purr softly, as if trying to ease her pain with his love. Despite the best efforts of the village doctor, Mrs. Jenkins' condition continued to worsen. Sensing that his beloved companion was nearing the end of her journey, Whiskers stayed by her side day and night, offering her the only comfort he could, his unwavering love. On a crisp autumn morning, Mrs. Jenkins passed away peacefully in her sleep, with Whiskers curled up beside her, his head resting on her hand. The villagers laid Mrs. Jenkins to rest in the village cemetery, under the shade of a majestic oak tree, with Whiskers sitting solemnly by her grave. Although Mrs. Jenkins was gone, her memory lived on in the hearts of the villagers, who would always remember her kindness and compassion. And as for Whiskers, he remained in the village, spending his days wandering the streets, a silent guardian watching over the place he had once called home, forever faithful to the old woman who had shown him the true meaning of love.